Underrated. What a word that is used very commonly in sports, especially in basketball. A couple years ago, the narrative was Damian Lillard was probably the most underrated point guard in basketball. That narrative seemed like it was going on for forever, and at one point, some people said he's so underrated to the point where people were starting to convince themselves that he was better than Stephen Curry. Then once the Damian Lillard stuff ended, next was Jrue Holiday. People were crediting Jrue Holiday with being the best perimeter defender in the league, as well as being good enough on offense to be a second option. And the excuse with these two people was that they both played for small market teams, so they didn't really get the proper exposure that other players like Stephen Curry or LeBron James would get because they play in a smaller market, so they're not getting as much media coverage. But the narrative with those two is long gone, but one term that people cannot seem to shake in the basketball world is underrated. Now, of course, there are a list of underrated players that you could bring up in the NBA. Players like a Seth Curry, a Jalen Brunson, or Malcolm Brogdon, they are players, when that term is brought up, who typically are the first names to come to mind. But what if I told you the real, most underrated player is a player that nobody is thinking about? As a matter of fact, earlier this season, his peers voted him as probably the most overrated player in the entire NBA. But I beg to differ, and that player is none other than Trae Young of the Atlanta Hawks. Now, I know what you're thinking off rip. Trae Young, underrated? No, you're probably like his peers and think that he's one of the more overrated players in basketball. But like I said, I beg to differ. Now, I'm not saying Trae is like some superstar player or he's the best player in the East, but I do think in recent years he's gotten a lot of flack, and I don't think he deserves it. But if you go through his career, you can see why. When he came in, the big thing was the trade between the Mavericks and the Hawks, which was basically a one-for-one exchange for Luka and Trae. And obviously since then, Luka has separated himself from Trae and is the obvious best player from that trade. But that shouldn't be a knock against Trae. Trae is an amazing player as well. This is a guy who's still a two-time All-Star, who still was an All-NBA member, and who is still one of the top point guards in the entire NBA, and arguably the best point guard in the Eastern Conference. But then you move on from that, and the narrative around him is he's too small, he's not built to be a number one on the team because he's little, he's defense sucks, and if he's the number one option on your team, you are not going far in the playoff. And then a year later, he took the Atlanta Hawks all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, where they ultimately lost to the NBA champion, the Milwaukee Bucks. And this was probably the height of Trae Young, and I think the fall off has been so steep since then. But let's remember how great Trae Young was in that playoffs. Do we forget how great of a series he had versus the Knicks? He averaged 29.2 points per game, dished out 9.8 assists per game, pulled down about 3 rebounds, and he did it on 44.1% field goal percent. Now, some of you guys might look at that as some lackluster stats or whatever, but that's pretty impressive, especially when he went in the Garden in a game that I wouldn't call must win, but a big momentum shift in the series, and he won. And he was faced with a lot of disrespect going into that series. He was bumped at half court, he was being booed by fans, and literally had fans saying bleep Trae Young. But through all of that, he overcame it and they won. And then they did it again in the next series versus the Sixers, which is another series that they were not favored to win at all. And this is another series in which Trae Young went off as well. He still averaged 29 points, but his assists went up to 10, and he got a steal a game, but his shooting did suffer. But they won nonetheless, and they would go on to face Milwaukee, and like I said, we all know how that played out. But since then, I think Trae Young has gotten a lot of disrespect being thrown to him. Now, it doesn't help that Atlanta struggled mightily next season after people were hoping they would take a leap, and Trae Young's stats suffered a little bit as well. On top of that, when they did get back to the playoffs, the whole Hawks team struggled, and Trae Young struggled as well, as he was only able to steal one game against Miami. And once this happened, a lot of people started throwing shade Trae's way. But honestly and truthfully, when you look at everything that has been said about him, I think he's overcome it. In his first 3 seasons in the NBA, one of the major knocks against Young was that he wasn't the most efficient scorer in the league. During that span, he shot just 41% from the field and 34.3% from 3-point range. But literally the next season, he shot better, as he shot 46% from the field, which was a career high, and his 3-point percentage went up as well, as he was averaging 38% from the field. And he did all of this on the second most attempts in his career, which is pretty darn impressive. I mean, imagine if you criticize a player their whole career and you say they're not efficient, and then they go on to have one of their most efficient seasons while shooting the most shots in their career. Sounds pretty impressive to me. On top of that, we know how great of a passer Trae is, as in last year he was averaging 9.7 assists per game, and this year he averaged 10. Both are top marks within the NBA. And as for the defense, I mean, this year Trae Young wasn't even that bad on defense. Now, of course, because of his small stature, he still is a defensive liability, and he's liable to get picked on by any and everybody on the court. But this year, it wasn't as bad as some people might make it seem. And then once you factor in what he gives you on the offensive end, I say Trae Young is a pretty positive player in the NBA, and he doesn't deserve all the disrespect that has been thrown his way. With that being said, I think there are some valid concerns out there. I do still think that his efficiency could get better, and I do still think that his defense is a big issue for a team where he's the #1 option. But with all of that being said, I don't think that deems him being named overrated or him being disrespected and called overrated and saying he's not as good as the #1 option like many have been saying. I think that he just has had a down year and he has some improvements to make, like all young players do. And Trae is no different than any other young player in the league, and I actually think a lot of the overrated and disrespect comes from the fact that we fail to realize that Trae Young is only 24 years old, and he just wrapped up his 5th season in the NBA. Now, of course, at this point, the Trae Young we know now probably is going to be the same Trae Young that we know in the future and when he gets later on into his career, but that's not to say some improvements can't be made. And on top of that, let's acknowledge the fact that Atlanta has failed to put a competent roster around him. The Hawks have made some very, and I mean very, questionable moves since Trae Young has been drafted. I mean, yeah, you have some positives like drafting DeAndre Hunter, and you can't blame them for moves like drafting Cam Reddish, but signing John Collins to an extension was questionable to me. Getting Bojan Bogdanovic was questionable to me. Trading Kevin Huerter away because you couldn't utilize him right was questionable to me. And the cherry on top was that horrendous trade for DeJounte Murray, who is a phenomenal player and in theory fits well next to Trae, but with all the stuff you gave up, that was really a bad move. And it makes it even worse when you look at the draft they had this year. You see, they drafted Kobe Buckton, who is a very great player and a very great prospect, but it makes you wonder, is DeJounte Murray on the move? Because we have, or at least I have heard some rumors and I've seen some speculation that he could be traded. Now, I don't think he'll be traded because they just gave up such a big package for him, but it's just crazy to think of that he might get traded because they realize that the whole duo with him and Trae isn't working. I mean, we did see John Collins get shipped off, but you have to wonder who is next, especially when you got to consider the fact, in my opinion, Atlanta is one of the teams who you have to look at this offseason as they are probably going to be, or they should be, one of the more active teams in the NBA. But that's all I really have for right now. I do think at this point in his career, Trae Young is very disrespected and has become pretty underrated in the NBA. I'm not saying he's the best guard in the league. I'm not saying he's not even the best guard in the East, but I do think that there has been a lot of disrespect and some people have really forgotten who he is. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments and let me know how you guys feel. If you disagree with me, say that. And if you like this video and you like this type of content, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. I make videos like this all the time, so if this is stuff you like, come on, subscribe, and you can see me drop videos like this all the time. But that's all I have for right now. Until next time, peace.